Okay, here we go. Front axle disassembly. First step, we got the tractor blocked up. That wheel's off the ground. We get the wheel off. And then we got these 12 bolts right here, the whole way around this outer hub assembly. So we're gonna get those first. Okay, so there's those 12 bolts all removed. We got a drip pan under there. There's probably going to be a gush of gear oil come out of this thing when I take it off. This hub outer assembly's got to come off. That'll take some hammering and probably a little bit of a pry once we get it separated from the hub. And we'll click back on in a minute when that's off. So there it is, the outer hub assembly off. This is called a sun gear, and you can see there's gear oil seeping out of the back part of this drum, which is supposed to be sealed. So anyway, obviously the seal's bad. Next to come off will be this sun ring, or sun gear, and then there's a retaining ring right here. That'll come off next. And the planetary itself is right there. Looks to be in pretty good shape. A little filthy with gear oil, but we'll get it all cleaned up. I forgot to mention that to get this retaining ring off, you take a punch and you hammer that way and it will turn the ring. And after that retaining ring, there's a lock ring in behind it, and that holds this whole planetary assembly in place. Once that retaining ring and lock ring's off, that'll just slide right out. So here we are back to the planetary assembly, and the lock ring, sorry, the retainer ring, lock ring, and there's a spacer in there. They're all now off, and this piece will slide right out. And I'll show you these pieces. This would be the piece that's the furthest most in, then the lock ring, then that retainer. So here we are, we've got that whole outside hub assembly off. That's the planetary, and the whole thing just slid right off. It's easier than trying to pull that out of the drum. And what we got here is the axle shaft, the stub I should say, and this is the outer bearing. And I should have cleaned these bolts off before I got this far, because we don't want to get any grit into that bearing. The whole thing's going through a part washer anyway before we put her back together, but the less crap you can get in that, the better off you are. Next up, we got to take these 12 bolts here on this hub assembly off and pull that whole piece out, and the inner bearing will come with it. Anyway, that's what's up next. And there's the inner hub assembly off. That's the axle. This is the axle stub here, and then two universal joints there that go right into the axle housing. And those universal joints look good to me, but there is another seal in behind that, so I'm going to pull the axle too and make sure that seal is good. And here's the piece we just took off right here. And there is another bearing on the other side of that. I don't want to move it now because I got my gloves off, and I don't want to stink like gear oil all night. And that's as far as we're going tonight by the time I get all this stuff cleaned up and get that covered up overnight for overnight. That's going to be enough. Hopefully the parts will be in on Friday or a little before, and we'll be able to get this thing all sealed up and back in action before the end of the weekend. So we're here in the basement cleaning parts up, and this is the stub axle that you saw, or the inner part of the stub. There's that bearing, and all the gear oil was collected down on this flange here. So it was this seal which seats up against it that was leaking. And I see this seal is all dished in and deformed. Probably just old, but doesn't look like a real high quality seal anyway. That was what was causing the leak. So we're going to finish getting all this crap cleaned up and get all this shit off this piece. And that'll probably be it for tonight. So taking advantage of a little bit of nice weather here, and we're gonna get this axle the whole way out of the axle housing here. With this one, like a lot of them have got some kind of a lock ring or a snap ring on the inside that holds it in. In this one, it's there's a bolt. I don't know if you can see that at all, but this bolt right here goes through the axle housing and into a groove on the. There's a carrier that holds the bearing on this axle, so that bolt has to be slacked off to get the axle out. And this one is already loose, so I'm just going to pull it out and show you what it looks like when it's out. And you want to be a little bit careful when you're doing this so you don't damage the splines on the axle. So you want to try and pull it out as straight as you can. And there it is. So that's it for this part. So here's what this axle looks like all cleaned up. This is the part that goes into the axle housing towards the center of the tractor. And this is the carrier, the bearing carrier. That bolt that goes through the axle housing engages this groove, and that stops the axle from coming out of the tractor. The universal joints are nice and good and tight. There's one here and one here, so I'm not going to replace those. And if you look down in here, you can see there's a bearing in there. This is a little awkward with one hand here, but anyway, in behind the bearing there's a seal, and that prevents the gear oil from leaking out of the axle housing and out into the knuckle. And I've tested this, just filled it up with parts cleaner, and it was all good. It never leaked. So that inner seal is good, and the bearing is good. That turns freely, and this axle is ready to put back in, and that's what we're doing now. So something I wanted to mention in the initial video, which I forgot. This is the retaining ring that we use to punch to hammer off of the threads. And when you do that, when you're punching on one of these things, you are doing damage. And I'm going to try to focus in here and show you. But we've got raised metal on the outside of that ring from punching it to get it off. And right here is probably the worst of it, which I don't know if I can get a good focus on that, but anyway, there is raised metal on the outside of that ring, and there is nothing else on the outside of that ring except for the sun gear. So as this gear is turning, you can see what it wants to do to that ring below it. It's moving it. And in my opinion, there should have been a spacer like this on the outside of that retainer, but there was none on the diagram that I have for the machine, and I can't get one for it. So what we're going to do to make sure that this gear can't bind on that ring is we're going to file any rough edges off completely and make sure that's just as smooth as could be before we put it back in the machine. And that hopefully will prevent that ring from binding on it. I'm still going to take a look around and see if I can find some other kind of a spacer that we could install on the outside. I don't know why they wouldn't have. I guess they just sort of slammed these tractors together when they were building them. The engineering's not that great on them. But anyway, that's a problem identified on the other side, and we're going to address that problem with this one before we go any further and put it back together. So here she is with the axle reinstalled. We're just going to clean that up a little bit and install the inner hub assembly. And we'll click the camera back on when we do that. So here's the piece that goes on next. Inner hub assembly, new seal in it. And this goes on right over the shaft. And we've got some forma gasket on here that's going to squish right out in between these flanges once we get her together. So we got the flange back on, and Greg is doing some tightening on these bolts. As those go in, you'll see the forma gasket start to compress and squirt out the sides. So there's that piece all bolted on and torqued up, and the next step's going to be the outer hub assembly, and we're going for that next. So there's the outer hub assembly with the ring gear in there, and we're going to punch that retainer ring so she's nice and tight, and then fold down one of the tabs to lock it. So right here you can see there's one of these tabs on the lock ring that I hit with the punch and damaged, bent it over, and that is probably what happened last time that cost me the other planetary. So we are gonna break that sucker off before we seal this thing up and make sure it doesn't go free floating inside this outer hub assembly. So there's the lock ring right in behind here with two tabs hammered down on it, retainer ring, and there's two tabs hammered down into that, so they're going to hold it nice. And the next thing up is the sun gear on this shaft, and the rest of the planetary on the outside. We're going to form a gasket on this ring here as well when we put that on. So there's the outer hub all back together, and we just got to fill it up with gear oil. To fill these up, you remove this center nut here, and you remove this plug up here with an Allen wrench, and then you fill up until the fluid starts to come out the center hole. That way you know you're full. Anyway, that's what's up next.